I have sat in this chair for more years than I care to count, and the one thing the wilderness has taught me is that it does not possess a heart. We like to project our human emotions onto the trees and the peaks as if the mountains care about our survival or our maps. They do not. They are indifferent machines of rock and ice and ancient silence. When a man walks into the high country of Montana, he is stepping into a place where the rules of the city are stripped away like dead skin. There is a specific kind of quiet that exists in the crazy mountains that feels heavy, as if the air itself is trying to press you into the dirt. It is a place where the logic of the modern world goes to die, and sometimes the people who go there follow suit. The case of Aaron Hedges is one that sticks in the back of my throat like wood ash. It was September of 2014 when the mountains decided to take him. Aaron was 38 years old, and he was not some city dweller looking for a pretty picture for a social media feed. He was a hunter, and he was seasoned. He knew the weight of a rifle, and the way the weather can turn on a dime in the high ridges. He was with two friends, and they were headed for a place called Sunlight Lake. The plan was simple enough, but in these stories the simple plans are the ones that unravel with the most violence. Aaron decided to split off from his group to find a cache of supplies they had left behind. He had a pack, and he had his wits, and he had the confidence of a man who believed he knew the terrain. By the time the sun began to dip behind the jagged spine of the mountains, the temperature started its long crawl toward the freezing mark. Aaron never made it to the cache. He never made it back to his friends. He simply stepped into the shadows between the lodgepole pines and vanished. When the report came in, the searchers expected to find a man who had perhaps twisted an ankle or taken a wrong turn at a fork in the trail. They did not expect to find a series of clues that defied every law of physics and human behavior. The search was massive. Dogs and helicopters and men with decades of experience combed the ridges. They found nothing for days until the mountain decided to give up a few pieces of the puzzle just to mock those looking for him. One of the search teams found his boots. This is where the narrative starts to fracture into something truly unsettling. The boots were found miles from where he was last seen, and they were sitting in a way that felt intentional. They were not scattered as if a predator had dragged him. They were just there. If you have ever walked a mile in the Montana wilderness without footwear, you know that the ground is a carpet of jagged shale and frozen pine needles that will tear the flesh from your bones in minutes. Yet, here were the boots, and there was no Aaron. A few days later, they found his backpack and his water bottle in a completely different direction. The items were being found in places that required Aaron to have crossed terrain that would challenge a mountain goat in the middle of a blizzard. Think about the physical reality of that for a moment. Picture the skin on the bottom of a human foot meeting the frozen grit of a mountain slope. The pain would be white, hot, and immediate. Every nerve ending would be screaming for him to stop, and yet the evidence suggests he kept moving upward and onward into the heart of the storm. The investigators were looking at a map that made no sense. The points where his gear was found did not form a trail. They formed a scatterplot of a man who was either being hunted by something invisible or who had lost his mind to a sudden and inexplicable force. There was no blood. There were no signs of a struggle with a bear or a mountain lion. Just the silence and the discarded remnants of a man who was being erased piece by piece. The weather during the search turned into a nightmare of wind and snow, which is a common thread in these disappearances. It is as if the sky itself conspires to hide the truth. The helicopters were grounded, and the ground crews were fighting just to stay warm. They called off the search after a week of finding nothing but more questions. Aaron Hedges became a name on a folder in a filing cabinet and a hole in the lives of his family. It was not until the following year that the mountain decided to reveal the final act of this tragedy. A local rancher was out on the other side of the range, miles away from the initial search area, when he found remains. The location of the remains was the final insult to logic. Aaron was found on a slope that was nearly impossible to reach from his last known position. To get there, he would have had to climb over ridges that rose thousands of feet into the air and descended into valleys choked with deadfall. He was found near a small creek, and his clothes were scattered in a way that suggested the final stages of hypothermia, where the brain tells the body it is burning up, and the victim strips off their only protection against the cold. But even that explanation feels thin when you look at the distances involved. How does a man walk miles without boots across the most punishing terrain in North America and end up on the wrong side of a mountain range? I have spent many nights looking at the topographical maps of the crazy mountains and trying to trace a line that makes sense. There is no line. There is only a leap of faith into the impossible. Some people talk about portals or shifts in the fabric of reality, and while that sounds like the talk of a man who has spent too much time in the sun, you have to wonder what else could explain it. There is a specific kind of madness that takes hold in the high country. It is not just the cold. It is a sensory deprivation that makes the mind start to invent things. But the mind cannot move a physical body across miles of jagged rock without shoes. The body has limits, and Aaron Hedges seemed to have bypassed all of them before he finally succumbed. The investigators found his camcorder and his phone, but they offered no clues to his state of mind in those final hours. It was as if he had simply stopped recording his life and started playing a part in a different story altogether. The condition of the remains was also a point of contention. In a landscape filled with scavengers like coyotes and wolves and bears, the body was remarkably intact for having been out there for an entire year. Usually the wild makes quick work of anything that stops moving. It cleans the bones and scatters the evidence until there is nothing left but dust. But Aaron was left there as if he were a monument to something we are not supposed to understand. When you look at the microscopic details of these cases, you see the same jagged edges, the missing shoes, the proximity to water, the impossible distances traveled, the sudden and violent shifts in weather that occur exactly when the person goes missing. It is a pattern that repeats across the globe from the national parks of the West to the deep forests of the East. We like to think we are the masters of the wild because we have GPS units and Gore-Tex jackets, but those things are just toys. When the mountain decides to fold the map, there is nothing you can do but wait for the end. Aaron Hedges was a man who did everything right, and he still ended up as a mystery that will never be solved. There is a theory that there are places on this earth where the veil is thin. Places where a person can step behind a tree and find themselves in a version of the woods that is not our own. I know how that sounds. It sounds like a ghost story told around a campfire to keep children from wandering off. But when you look at the files, and you see the boots sitting neatly on a rock and the backpack miles away and the body on the other side of a mountain peak, you have to ask yourself what else is left. If it was not a human, and it was not an animal, and it was not a simple accident, then we are left with the unthinkable. We are left with the idea that there is something in the woods that we have not named yet. I think about the searchers who spent days looking for him. I think about the dogs that could not find a scent even though the man had just passed through. That is another recurring detail in these missing 411 cases. The dogs simply refuse to track, or they act as if they are terrified of something the humans cannot see. They sit down and they whine, or they try to hide between their handlers' legs. They know. Animals have a sense for the predatory nature of the landscape that we have long since buried under layers of civilization. They smell the ozone and they feel the static in the air, and they know that it is time to leave. The crazy mountains are named that for a reason. The legend says that a woman went mad in those hills after her family was killed, and the mountains absorbed her grief and her insanity. I think it is more likely that the mountains were already like that, and she was just the first one to give it a name. There is a vibration in the rock there that feels like a low-frequency hum. If you stay long enough, it starts to rattle your teeth. It makes you want to move and keep moving until you find a place where the sound stops. Maybe that is what happened to Aaron. Maybe he was just trying to get away from a sound that only he could hear. The final report on Aaron Hedges is a cold document. It lists the cause of death as undetermined or hypothermia depending on which official you talk to. It uses words like tragic and unfortunate. But those words are just bandages on a gaping wound. They do not explain the shoes. They do not explain the miles of mountain he crossed in the dark and the cold. They do not explain why the mountain waited a year to show us where he was. It is a closed case that will never truly be closed, because the math does not add up. The geometry of his disappearance is skewed, and no amount of official jargon can straighten it out. We live in an age where we think everything can be tracked and measured. We have satellites that can see a dime on the sidewalk from space. But the deep woods are a blind spot. They are a place where the signal drops out and the compass needle spins in circles. When you walk into the trees, you are taking a gamble that the world will remain consistent. You are betting that the ground will stay under your feet and the air will remain breathable and the path will lead you back home. Aaron Hedges lost that bet, and the most terrifying part is that he did not even know he was playing until the game was already over. The cynicism I feel after looking at hundreds of these cases is not born out of a lack of empathy. It is born out of frustration. It is the frustration of seeing a pattern and knowing that no one in a position of authority wants to admit it exists. They would rather call it a series of coincidences than admit that there is a predator or a phenomenon that they cannot control. To admit that people are being plucked off the face of the earth by something we cannot see would be to admit that the wilderness is not a park, it is a hunting ground. And we are not the ones with the rifles. I look at the photos of the area where Aaron was found, and I see the beauty of it. The golden light of the late afternoon hitting the peaks. The crystal clear water of the creeks. It looks like a postcard. It looks like a place where you could find peace. But then I remember the boots. I remember the clean socks on a man who had been missing for weeks in the mud and the snow. I remember the silence that the searchers described. That beauty is a lure. It is the bright colors of a deep-sea fish that draws you in before the jaws snap shut. Aaron Hedges is not an isolated incident. He is a data point in a much larger and much darker map. If you look at the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the mountains of Colorado, you see the same fingerprints. A young boy who vanished while walking just a few feet ahead of a group of adults. His remains were found years later on a cliff face that a child could never have climbed. Or consider the case of Danny Philippidis, who went missing from a ski resort in New York and turned up 6 days later in California with no memory of how he got there, still wearing his ski gear. These are not accidents. These are anomalies that suggest a tear in the way we understand the world. The mystery of the crazy mountains remains, and the wind still blows through those ridges with the same indifference it showed in 2014. Aaron Hedges is gone, and the mountain has moved on to the next season and the next traveler. But for those of us who look at the files and listen to the stories, the mountains will never look the same. We know that the trees are watching, and the rock is waiting. We know that sometimes when you walk into the woods, you do not just get lost. You get taken. And the mountain does not care if you ever come back. It is a heavy thing to carry this knowledge. To look at a forest and see not a sanctuary but a maze with no exit. We will keep digging, and we will keep asking the questions that no one wants to answer, because the people who vanished deserve that much. They deserve to be more than just a name on a folder. They deserve for us to acknowledge that what happened to them was not normal. It was not right. And it could happen to anyone who steps off the pavement and into the tall grass. Stay safe out there, and remember that the most dangerous thing in the woods is the thing you cannot see until it is too late.